Good evening, everybody. I want to welcome you to our second lecture of this semester, which is part of the project on global language justice. The project Global Language Justice is supported by the Mellon Sawyer. It's one of the Mellon Sawyer seminars hosted here at Columbia. And this is our second year of that Mellon Sawyer seminar series. And the project itself, Global Language Justice, tries to think about the question of language justice, the endangerment of language, its disappearance, along the model of the disappearance of sort of climate catastrophe. So associates and tries to think through analogically the ways in which we may think about the project of both the disappearance and the endangerment of language, and what it means to think through the project of language justice, both along the model of climate change and catastrophe on the one hand, but to also think about new ways in which the project of language justice, doing justice to language, might be revivified and rethought by engaging with new protocols, new platforms, and new ways of engaging with digital worlds and other spaces that might help us to reimagine the worlds that we might be in imminent danger of losing. So with that in mind, it's really a great pleasure for me to introduce today's speaker, Moria Paz. Moria shares her time between the Stanford Law School and the Center on National Security and the Law at Georgetown University Law Center. She'll be speaking this evening on a topic called the Tower of Babel, Human Rights and the Paradox of Language. Moria is a legal scholar focusing on the intersection of immigration law, international law, security policy, international organizations, and human rights. She's currently completing 2 books. One is called Network or State, International Law and the History of Jewish Self-Determination, which is forthcoming next year with Oxford University Press, and The Law of Strangers, Critical Perspectives on Jewish Lawyering and International Legal Thought, which is co-edited with James Loeffler and is forthcoming also next year with Cambridge University Press. Her work is extremely well known and highly regarded. It's won numerous prizes and awards, including the Law and Humanities Interdisciplinary Writing Competition, the New Voices selection of the European Journal of International Law, a New Voice panel of the American Association of International Law, and a Junior Faculty Forum for International Law, in addition to the Leyland Prize for the most outstanding paper in international law, awarded by Harvard Law School in 2007. Moria was herself trained at Harvard Law School, and before that attended the University of London, SOAS, and Beijing Normal University. Please help us welcome her this evening, and we look forward to engaging with her afterwards on her talk. Thanks.
Thank you so much for this lovely introduction, and thank you for inviting me. It's really good to be here today. It's really good to see all of you. Today I'm going to talk about the way in which human rights law protect the right of minorities to preserve their language. But before I launch into the talk, I wanted to think about language for a minute. So let me do it by offering you an example. So imagine a mother, and she has 2 children, and she lives here in New York. She is French speaker, so her mother tongue is French, but she is capable of expressing herself very well also in English. Okay, so does she speak to her children in French, because this is her language, her first language, the language of her parents, the language of her ancestors, the language of her culture? Or does she speak to them in English because this is the dominant language and she speaks good English, and that will equip the children better when they talk to their children, when they need to take a standardized exam, if they fall and need to see a doctor and to explain to the doctor what just happened to them. So here the question is, what is the function of language? Or maybe the mom comes up with a compromise. She's going to talk to them in French at home, but she will send them to schools that use English as the medium of instruction. In doing so, she will also give them the gift of being bilingual. But probably it's safe to assume that she's going to know that English is going to end up the primary language of the children, so the stronger language of the children. But maybe that's okay, because to the extent that you want to protect culture, the culture is not at any risk if the children speaks better English than French. But what if the situation was different? So what if now the language is not French, but it's Romanesque? Romanesque is a language that is now currently spoken by 60,000 people worldwide. And now the survival of the language is absolutely contingent on those two kids able to speak Romanesque as their first language, being completely fluent in this language. And by the way, this is not an unusual situation. Every 14 days, a language dies. And when the language dies the culture. So think about it. Die the accumulated knowledge of the culture, the accumulated experiences of the culture, the beauty of the culture, the complexity of the culture dies. So if that happens, we all of us lose, because we lose the beauty of this culture. So is it more important in this case to make sure that the mother speaks to the children in their first language, in the Romanesque language? So now the question goes to the value of protecting the language. And who decides? Okay, so say the mom decides that she's going to speak, who decides as well as who bear the cost of speaking the Romanesque language? So does the mom have to bear the cost by herself, by buying books and buying movies and by fighting with her kids over speaking the language and sending them to Sunday school? Does the Romanesque community, the 60,000 people, have to bear the cost by producing those movies and producing those books? Or do all of us have to pay the cost? Because we all lose if the Romanesque language dies. So do we need to bear the cost by, for example, providing schools that use the Romanesque language as the medium of instruction? What about the children, those two kids in my example? Is it fair to ask them, those two children, to carry the burden of preserving a language that only 60,000 people speak in the world? Is it fair to ask them to put the effort into becoming bilingual in a language that so few people speak? So minorities all over the world have very strong feeling about those questions and about how much they are willing to do in order to preserve their languages. There are many examples, but I'm just going to give two. For some minorities, the protection of the languages is so important that it's the site, it's the core of the nationalist conflict with the majority. And so, for example, a leading historian in Catalonia explained, and this is a quote, "Catalan nationalism is basically a language movement. We are Catalan because we speak Catalan." Other minorities feel so strongly about their language and the preservation of their language that they are willing to take arms to protect the language. Indeed, imprisoned Kurdish rebel leader Adal Öcalan emphasized, quote, that it was the Turkish ban on the Kurdish language that provoked the PKK armed revolt against the Turkish government. Majorities in turn also have a very strong feeling about the protection of their own language and the threat that is posed to the protection of their language by minorities. And we don't need to go far. Recall the then presidential candidate Donald Trump being completely indignant that Jeb Bush used Spanish in a campaign rally. At the same time, we also live in a world where human rights advocacy and litigation are increasingly becoming prevalent. Indeed, our era is an era that in no small measure defined through our commitment to human rights law. So here is a crucial question. How does international human rights law organize language rights? And by language rights in this context, I mean minority right to use and to preserve the distinct language. The astonishing fact about this question is that what we think the law does, and we think it based on what major human rights treaties and prominent scholars said that the law is doing, is not in fact what is happening in reality on the ground when members of minorities bring forth claims that have to do with the protection of languages. In other words, underlying the human rights advocacy and litigation on the right of minorities to preserve the language, there is a serious conflict that pits the law in the books as opposed to the law in action. And these conflicts forces us to really rethink our fundamental assumption about the nature and function in human rights law, and perhaps most importantly, who does the law serve? Whose interests does the law promote? The best way to understand this conflict is to start with the law in the books, what the law says it does. So major human rights instruments and leading scholars suggest two key functions that language serves. First, at an individual level, language is constitutive of identity. We are what we speak. At a collective level, linguistic pluralism increases diversity. Here, heterogeneity in language has a positive value. It enhances cultural diversity, which benefit all of us, all of the society. So those who defer to this function of language identity constitutive often draw an example from nature, and indeed in your introduction you also drew on nature. And here the logics go, the extinction of a language, say the Romanesque language, much like the extinction of animal species, hurts the entire ecosystem. In fact, I also noticed this analogy on your the website of the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society when describing the Global Language Justice Initiative. Now, given the relative weakness of minorities, if the language remains unprotected, they are at a greater risk of losing their distinct identity. In this approach, the injury will be borne, of course, by the minority, but by all of us, by the entire society. Because diversity is good, human rights treaties and scholars argue that the international human rights regime ought to enforce the right of linguistic minorities for a fairly high level of linguistic separatism. There is, however, another way of viewing the function of language. This can be called communicative as opposed to identity constitutive. Seen from this perspective, language is above all a social tool that facilitates market operation and support political unification. So here, value is assigned to the smooth operation of the market and the political state. Linguistic diversity is now assumed to be a cost, not a benefit to society. After all, remember the biblical story about the Tower of Babel. So here in that story, God confuses the languages in order to impose the cost of confusion, not to bestow the gift of diversity. So because they were unable, because each one of those builders spoke a different language, they were unable to collaborate and to build the tower. So the preferred solution to a linguistic multiplicity is now the speedy assimilation of the minority into the dominant language of the public sphere. What I'd like to suggest to you today is that in contrast to the treaty regime and to the language of scholars, it is the second approach, the communicative, that is actually advanced by human rights courts and quasi-judicial institutions. In practice, those courts are not willing or not prepared to force states to swallow the robust costs that are associated with the dramatic costs that are associated with a true diversity protecting regime. Instead, they are concerned with the right of minorities to assimilate on fair terms into the dominant language and culture. So this is important, so it's worth repeating. They talk about diversity, but in fact, in reality, they ask the minority to internalize the cost of maintaining its separate language and culture. They are not prepared to ask the state to pay for it. To demonstrate my claim, I looked at how the United Nations Human Rights Committee and the European Court of Human Rights dispose of cases that bear on language. I selected these two institutions because they both create rights that are judicially enforceable by individual submission, that is to say that individual can bring cases before those bodies, and that they lead to generally applicable decision. That is to say that if the European Court of Human Rights reach a decision regarding a particular set of facts, it applies for all the other or similar situated individual in its jurisdiction. The rights approach, moreover, provides the linguistic interest of the minorities with a prima facie presumptive invoidability. That means that the court ex ante is expected to respect, to protect those interests. Okay, so let me begin by kind of a very quick recap of the normative framework. What's the law? The law to which the United Nations Human Rights Committee is expected to adhere under the ICCPR, International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, Article 27, provides a seemingly absolute right to the use of a minority language. The article provides, this is a quote, "Persons belonging to minorities shall not be denied the right to enjoy their own culture and to use their own language." Now this directive is feminine negative, shall not be denied the right. But the Human Rights Committee, the United Nations Human Rights Committee, the body that is charged with interpreting and enforcing the ICCPR, has made clear, quote, that the article calls for a positive legislative, judicial or administrative commitment on the part of the state to protect the identity of a minority. Language rights claims are further elaborated in other international legal instruments, and prominent scholars, moreover, have further pushed the article in the direction of a strong positive or affirmative right that contains, in the words of one of them, no limitation. Those are the words of Henry Steiner from Harvard Law School. The European Convention of Human Rights, in turn, doesn't include any general standard for the use of language or any specific minority right. Article 14 of the Convention simply makes discrimination on the basis of language a suspect classification. That means that the court is going to apply the highest level of scrutiny in cases that involve discrimination on the basis of language. But in the past decade, the court has greatly expanded the scope of the provision to justify the adoption of positive action to redress situations that involve systematic disadvantage that are brought about by a history of discrimination. Indeed, prominent EU scholars, for instance, Bruno De Viti, argue, quote, that there is no doubt that Article 14 of the European Convention of Human Rights is being developed so as to require positive state action for the purpose of protecting minority language rights, end of quote. Now, according to both bodies, the United Nations Human Rights Committee and the European Court of Human Rights, the reason, the motivation for protection is the two essential functions of language that I mentioned at the beginning, identity constitutive and diversity enhancing. So, for example, in DHV, the Czech Republic, a 2007 case adjudicated by the Grand Chamber, that is the full court, the highest authority of the European Court of Human Rights, with 17 judges, explained that there is an emerging international consensus recognizing the special interest of the minorities and an obligation to protect them, to protect the identity of the minorities. And why? This obligation is not only for the purpose of safeguarding the interests of the minority themselves, but to preserve cultural diversity or value for the whole community. Remember, we started with the analogy to nature. The bee, for instance, dies, we all die, minority dies, we all lose, we lose diversity. So given this existing legal framework, we would expect that when members of minorities submit claims before, so when it's come to the United Nations Human Rights Committee, submit communication before this body, the protection that is going to afford it to them would be robust. Equally, we could reasonably anticipate that the European Court of Human Rights will be willing to expand Article 14 to provide positive protection for minority language speakers. And finally, we would assume that the motivation, the reason for protection is diversity. We want diversity. But this is not at all what's happening on the ground. So I examined all the cases of communication that were brought before those enforcement bodies in two main areas of conflict. First, whether the state must facilitate the use of minority languages in court proceeding by providing interpreter, translator paid by the state. Second, whether the state must subsidize parent choices to the language of instruction in public schools. And in total, I systematically examined a little over 200 cases of communication. And this is what I found. I'm going to now quickly detail what I found. In reality, the United Nations Human Rights Committee and the European Court of Human Rights do not insist on a minority right to protect, to preserve, to maintain the separate language and culture. Instead, those two courts that have, those two enforcement bodies that have very different laws in the book converge on a common standard for the protection of minority language speakers. They don't protect minority language speakers or the minority language right as a fundamental human right in the conventional sense that the right necessarily trumps other countervailing interests. Instead, they do protect three much narrower interests that are not themselves language specific. So they enforce a minority language accommodation first as a subsidiary mechanism to realize another right. Second, as a transitory right for linguistic assimilation. And third, as an outcome of a political compromise. What I'm going to do now is going to give a quick example for how those interests emerge in case law. And I'm going to give one example for each category of protection, but of course I'm happy to discuss or to offer more examples during the Q&A. This is just a question of time until I very elegantly fall with my bottle of water. Okay, so first, court accommodate a minority language when doing so is necessary to promote another universally recognized human rights, most importantly the right to a fair trial. So they accommodate the language when it attaches itself to another right, but that right is not about language. So consider, for example, Guerre d'Envie France is a communication that was brought before the United Nations Human Rights Committee. This communication dealt with a Breton-speaking person. So Breton is a Celtic language spoken in Brittany, which is a region in France. He was charged in criminal proceeding, and he demanded to give his testimony in the Breton language through the assistance of an interpreter. The French court denied his claim and said, hey, you're bilingual, you speak French. So he went to the Human Rights Committee. And this is what he explained. He explained that he wants to use the Breton language because Breton was the language of his ancestors. And moreover, it is the language in which he expresses himself with ease. He speaks better, but it's easier for him. He alleged violation of both Article 14 of the ICCPR, this is the right to fair trial, and Article 27 of the ICCPR, this is the right for minorities to use their separate language. But the United Nations Human Rights Committee declined to consider Article 27, the right to the use of minority languages violation, and instead make its determination only on the basis of Article 14, the right to a fair trial. Yes. And this is what the committee said. The requirement of a fair hearing does not mandate state parties to provide the services of an interpreter for an accused if he is capable of speaking adequately in the official language. After denying Article 14 violation, the right to a fair trial, the committee decided that it was not, that's a quote, that it was not necessary in this case to address Article 27 of the Convention, that is the right for minority to use their own language. Now, these were very well surprises. The right to fair trial and the right to the use of minority languages offer very different types of protections. The right for fair trial is concerned with due process. Due process is satisfied with only adequate mutual comprehension between accused and the court. The test for what constitutes adequate level of comprehension is pragmatic. Fairness only dictates that an accused should be able to understand the charges against him or her, and if not, the state will provide him with an interpreter. But the accused has no right to either choose the language in which he will defend himself, or the language in which the trial will be held. In contrast, Article 27 confers on linguistic minorities a fundamental right to, remember the wording of Article 27, to use their own language. The fact that a particular minority might be bilingual, as many of them are, is irrelevant for the operation of the right to the use of minority languages. For the Human Rights Committee, faithful to this more robust protection, it had at least to consider that the accused would be allowed to speak in their minority language, even if he, in this case, was able to understand the majority language. So what we see here in this category of protection, yes, the language of defendants who do not speak the majority languages is accommodated in court proceeding. But it is accommodated only insofar as it is necessary or is strictly needed for the accused to understand the charges against him or her. So only say like that much. As soon as the accused is able to understand the charges, that is, as soon as the simulation begins, the right disappears. Protection ends. Why? Because the accused was able to overcome the language barrier and is now able to understand the language of the majority. So the protected good here is procedural justice. It is not diversity. And this protected ties the value of language to instrumental communication alone. A second circumstance in which courts offer protection to minority languages is when doing so is necessary to assist minorities in their effort to acquire the dominant language of their public sphere. So here, yes, courts are going to accommodate the language of the minority, but only as a station toward its final elimination. The interest in the language here is purely assimilationist and transitory in nature. Now I'm going to give an example from the jurisdiction of the European Court of Human Rights, and it's a case of a 2010 case, Autos v. Croatia, again a case that was decided by the Grand Chamber. The case concerned the claim of Roma students, colloquially known as gypsies, that were all primary school students, and they were barred from participating in public school classes because they kept failing on entry-level examinations that were conducted in the majority language, not in their own minority language. So they appealed to the court. In deciding the case, the court has also discussed whether a state has any positive obligations toward the education of linguistic minorities in public schools. And this is what the court said. The central question was whether adequate steps were taken by the school authorities to ensure the applicant's speedy progress in acquiring an adequate command of the majority language. The court held that in the intermediate time, the applicant children could be placed in special classes that use their own minority language with only, quote, supplementary instruction in the Croatian language, end quote. But what's the goal? The goal is, quote, that they could quickly be integrated into mixed classes where education was in the majority language only. What's so interesting about this case is that here the regime developed by the European Court of Human Rights converged with the level of protection afforded by the American Supreme Court. Indeed, there's a very famous case that was decided by the American Supreme Court, Lau v. Nicole, that dealt with Chinese students in San Francisco, which come out very, very similarly to this case. Now, why is this alignment surprising? As I mentioned earlier, the European Convention of Human Rights included at least the potential of, for protecting language rights as human rights. The relevant law in the US, in contrast, does not recognize language rights as substantive rights at all. So this model of linguistic accommodation developed in this category of protection is minimal. Protection presumably lasts only as long as it is needed to prevent irreparable harm to the student so that they don't fall behind on their education just because they don't speak the majority language. But again, as soon as the language barrier is overcome, as soon as assimilation began, the right to the special linguistic accommodation disappears. So ultimately the concern here is to promote assimilation on fair terms. It is not about the continuation of the minority language. Now let me get to the third and final circumstance in which courts protect minority language rights. So in this category, courts afford protection to minority languages when doing so is necessary to achieve a political compromise that was reached between the minority and the majority on the national level. In contrast to the interest in minority languages that is directed toward procedural or assimilationist ends, this kind of protection is very strong and perpetual. But even in such states, the thick protection is afforded to only a limited number of minority languages and their speakers, and is a far cry from a universal human right. Either a national or international court can enforce such compromise, such political compromise, and I'm going to give one quick example for each court. I'll begin with the Canadian Supreme Court. So I'm going to, the example comes from the case of Ma v. Alberta. I think it's a 1990 case, and it's a really, really seminal case that was decided by the court and dealt with a claim of French-speaking parents that were dissatisfied with the level of education in the French language given to the children in public school. So they appealed to the court. And in deciding the case, the Canadian Supreme Court began by saying kind of the identity constitutive function of language. And the court insists, quote, language is a part and parcel of the identity and the culture of the people speaking it. But when the court is coming to actually decide in the case, this is what the judges are saying. The protection of entrenched language rights in Canada was the result of a compromise. What's the term of the compromise? To preserve and to promote the two official languages of Canada and their respective cultures. As the court made a point of noting, it would be, quote, totally incongruous for other linguistic minorities that were not part of the original political settlement to invoke the aid of the special rights that were granted only to French and English speakers. So this type of linguistic protection that derived from an original political compromise means that, yes, French speakers will be protected all across Canada, even when they are in the minority. But the Vietnamese speaker is not going to be better protected in Canada than had she lived in the US. And again, this is puzzling. The US is a jurisdiction that recognizes no substantive language rights. You will not find the Supreme Court ever saying language is a part and parcel of identity. The American law only provides negative linguistic liberties that prohibit the state to ban the use of minority languages in the private sphere. So here we have a jurisdiction that promised this and actually protect this when it's not French speakers. What happened with such a national compromise reach either a regional or international human rights court? Well, both the United Nations Human Rights Committee and the European Court of Human Rights are extremely deferential to the terms of the original historic political settlement. I'll give an example from the European Court of Human Rights. In a series of cases, the court has enforced an original political pact so as to deny French speakers in Belgium robust language accommodation. And in this, what the court is doing is upholding the term of a national compromise that was reached in Belgium that essentially divided Belgium into 4 territories, each with one language with the exception of Brussels, which is both French and Flemish. So the country as a whole is multilingual, but each territory is monolingual. This political compromise was hammered down between around 1960 to 1980s. At the same time, French speakers in Belgium are bringing case after case before the European Court of Human Rights. And what the court is saying is go back to the terms of the national compromise. Go back to the term of the national compromise. And I'll give you the example of Clairfait v. Belgium, where the European Court of Human Rights examined the claim of 2 French speakers that lived in a Flemish area. They were elected to political positions, and they demanded to take, they needed to take an oath before they assumed their position, and they demanded to take the oath in the French language. They were not allowed to do it. They couldn't assume their position. They went to the court. The court denied the application and forced the petitioner to conform to the term of the historic settlement. And this is what the judges are saying. The criteria used to pick the language of oath-taking fits into a general institutional system of the Belgian state based on the territoriality principle. This system, the judges are saying, is designed to achieve an equilibrium between the kingdom's various regions and cultural communities. The objective? To diffuse language disputes. And this objective, this aim, is not only legitimate in and of itself, but also clearly emerges from debate in a democratic national parliament. So what we see here in the third and final circumstance in which court accommodate minority languages is that robust protection is afforded to some minority languages. But the motivation for protecting those languages has nothing to do with a desire to promote maximal linguistic diversity or to protect an authentic expression of culture. Rather, it's a response to the historically rooted political power of selecting minorities to win concessions. So it's a way of allocating resources within a single economy. The right is therefore an expression of local politics. It is not an expression, it is not a support for universal human rights. Okay, so let me just wrap up what I tried to propose to you until now. The express commitment of human rights law is to protect minority languages as constitutive of identity and culture. A close examination of case law revealed that something quite different is happening here. International courts and quasi-judicial institutions protect a different and much narrower sets of interests. They accommodate the language of minorities only as far as it is needed as a mean to secure minimal notion of fairness, of due process, as far as it is needed to assimilate the minority into the majority languages on fair terms, and to protect the compromise that was necessary to secure political stability in the state. This persistent gap between law in the books and law in action has resulted in two separate legal regimes with very different distributional outcomes. The law in the book views the interest of linguistic and cultural preservation and of diversity as important public goods. Because they're important for all of us. Remember, the language dies, we all suffer, the bee dies, we all suffer. All of us, all taxpayers within the jurisdiction are assumed to are requested to assume responsibility for providing diversity. The law in action, in turn, prioritizes the functioning of the market and the political state. Here, the key interest is in the speedy assimilation of the minority into the dominant language on fair terms. Now, the state is expected to assist in this process in a limited and transitional way by assuming some of the costs that are associated with kind of as learning the majority language, kind of overcoming the language barrier. So what are we to make of this disjunction between official rhetoric and judicial practice on the ground? So, as often in life, the answer depends on who you are, what's your perspective. From the perspective of linguistic minorities that seek to make the community, the language community, viable over the long run, and from the perspective of human rights advocates that support them in doing that, this outcome is obviously disappointing. The law is simply not providing what it promises to do. But from the perspective of society as a whole, and indeed from the perspective of individual members of the minority, the scale-back approach actually followed may carry important political benefits. The Human Rights Committee and the European Court of Human Rights converge on a monolingual, sometimes bilingual public sphere. They permit the state to actively incentivize the assimilation of the minority into the dominant language of the state. But they also provide minorities with narrow procedural guarantees and transitory assistance in the time that it takes to assimilate. At the same time, in the private sphere, in the home, in the market, the international community, those international enforcement bodies also preserve a minimum area of linguistic freedom. Recall, they don't allow the state to ban the use of minority languages in the private sphere. But the minority has to internalize the cost of maintaining its own separate language. So the result is a regime of cultural preservation. Because the state doesn't interfere in the market sphere, there is a regime of multiplicity of languages. But it is one that is achieved on the cheap for the majority. This regime sets a floor on the protection granted to linguistic minorities. It only says, you state can't ban them from using their language in the private sphere. It doesn't set a ceiling. Individual states, and Canada is a very good example, can decide that they are going to afford certain minority and their languages more robust protection if the majority deems it appropriate in light of the state's specific constraint. Now, doing this is likely the best chance of producing politically feasible and economically practical solution for language strife. Let me close now by noting the concrete ramification of all this. Okay, so first in terms of resource allocation. To the extent that minorities seek to protect their language and culture for the long time, and to the extent that human rights advocates want to support them in that, they're probably better off directing their resources toward battles, political battles on the national level, not legal battle on the regional or international level. Because the international and the regional regimes are more effective once a political settlement has already been achieved on the national level. If they do go to international litigation, there are also lessons here for lawyers. Those who seek to advance a language claim on behalf of minorities will likely do better by emphasizing the communicative function of language, not the identity constitutive function of language. So for instance, by suggesting that protecting minorities and their languages is going to help them with employment, it's going to enhance the possibility of getting jobs, it's going to help in fighting their poverty, it's going to help them when they are going to apply to achieve higher degrees in higher education. And not about how language is about protecting the language is about protecting their identity and protecting their culture. Finally, there's a broader normative pressure that underlines this entire area of the law. Most importantly, is language primary a mode of cultural self-expression? So what the law is here protecting is diversity. Or is it a method of communication? So what the law is protecting is the operation of the state. Diversity demands strong right of protection. The unification of the state is inclined toward fair terms of assimilation. Universal communication, which is essential for the operation of the state, is attained by linguistic homogeneity, which is of course the opposite of linguistic diversity. And this is an impossible dilemma. Human rights treaties and advocates found a way of squaring the circle. How they do it, how they square the circle, they are prioritizing only one function of language, only the identity constitutive of a function of language. In doing that, in kind of prioritizing only the identity constitutive function and not the communicative function of language, they structure an entire debate on the allocation of scarce resources within a single economy without ever talking about the cost of non-assimilation. And those costs are dramatic, both for the majority and for the minority. So given finite resources within a single economy, effort to accommodate linguistic heterogeneity in the market sphere compete with other legitimate demands of the majority. So for instance, hiring teachers that can teach in a minority language may mean that there is less money left to hire teachers that can teach students with disability. Further, a successful regime of a full linguistic accommodation can itself hurt the very minority that advocates seek to protect. So if they become fluent in, say in my example for the beginning, become fluent in Romanesh, but they live in the US, they may fall behind in the larger economic and political hierarchies of the state. Now, human rights advocates and scholarship obscure this question of cost in two separate ways. First, the assent on diversity as a valuable culture, a cultural asset for the whole society, makes cost consideration disappear. We are all supposed to benefit. Second, the choice of a rights vocabulary makes cost consideration irrelevant. So a right to the use of minority languages prioritize the linguistic interest of the minority over the countervailing cost of policy consideration of the state. So I began my talk by asking all of us to think a little bit about language. Let me now end by suggesting that those of us, and I put myself in this category, are concerned about the disappearing of languages, who are concerned about the protection of minorities. We probably should focus on the national political level rather than the international level. And why? Because when it comes to human rights law, even if at the level of standards, linguistic and cultural plurality is celebrated, in reality, in practice, courts and quasi-judicial institutions settle cases bearing on linguistic disputes by permitting the state to actively incentivize the assimilation of their minorities. What does this mean? This suggests that ultimately the commitment of human rights law to pluralism is at best skin deep. So at the end of the day, it is not about the number of laws making the language right of minorities a universal human right. Rather, it's the terms of particular national domestic compromises, especially who benefits, who pays, who is left out, that determine the degree to which any particular language regime can be held or can be said to be fundamentally just. Thank you so much, and I'm hoping that now we can all talk about it, talk about the protection of language.
Thank you so much. Moria, may I handle the questions
yes,
for you?
Yes, of course.
Yeah. So we're open for questions. So, yeah.
Yeah. Hi. It's nice to see you, Moria. Do you think that, I mean, what I do take away from your presentation is that there's just inherent weaknesses in international human rights law, especially when it comes to linguistic rights, right? But do you think that this weakness is specific to linguistic rights, or do you think that this is just the pointlessness of the international human rights law mechanism?
So, directly to the meat of the okay, so not at all the pointlessness of human rights, not at all. So, first of all, I want to separate between litigation and litigation, bringing cases before the court, to using right vocabulary, human right vocabulary on the ground in political negotiation on the national level, on the national domestic level. So I think that human rights law has a lot of symbolic power when you say you are a Chinese dissident and you go to the Chinese government and say, I have a universal human right. This is different from bringing the claim before a regional international court. Now, even when bringing claims before those enforcement bodies, I think it's really important to understand what is happening in reality on the ground. Because once we understand what is happening in reality on the ground, it allows us to better protect the people that we have their interests at heart, the people that we're trying to protect. So once we know what is happening, we can understand what's the best way. So for instance, with language rights, probably as I suggested at the end, if you do end up with litigation, emphasize the communicative. Don't buy into the language of treaties and scholars. Don't emphasize the language constitutive. It's not going to help you. Emphasize the communicative function of language. And what I try to do, but from a kind of a broader normative perspective, I'm using, this is part of a bigger project of mine to try and map out how human rights courts resolve tension between conflicting ideas that are both good but are conflicting. So here it's about the right of the state to function as opposed to the right of the minority to preserve their language identity. Tomorrow it's the right of the state to control its border as against the right of refugees to escape persecution. And I'm trying to map the particular way that court negotiate this tension and what they're doing in reality on the ground. And overall, I'm trying to suggest that at the end of the day, I call it very different rights are involved, they have different strategies. So here what they do is they take a universal right and they narrow it into a small interest. Tomorrow I'll talk about how they take a universal right, but in fact narrow down who can bring this right. But overall, what I'm trying to suggest is that they're extremely deferential to state interests once you come to the court, which then means that, say, I, a member of a linguistic minority, need to know I'm not coming to, the playing field is not equal. Those courts from the very beginning are deferential to the interests of the state. This is a system built by states for states. So it's something to bear in mind before we get to international litigation.
Yeah.
I'm Rosemary Salomon from St. John's. I think if you think of the case of the Laussi case from Italy, it had to do with the
What case?
The Laussi case, the permissibility of
The cross, yeah.
the crucifix,
Yeah.
in public schools.
Yeah.
And the court there upheld it because it was a matter of national identity, which sounded a bit odd to even those of us who were raised Catholic. That this was really a religious symbol, and yet the court really deferred to the sovereignty of Italy to define what their religion, what their identity is, their cultural identity. So I mean, that's another loop that you could bring in. But going back to, you mentioned Lau versus Nichols in the United States, and I think Lau versus Nichols is even worse than you portrayed it.
Yeah.
Because the court merely said that these children were entitled to a meaningful education. They weren't entitled to education in their language, even for assimilative purposes. So it could have been just, they could be given the same facilities and materials, whatever. So they could be given something else, something special, smaller classes, different facilities, but not necessarily their own language. And what you're saying about, in Europe, they should just bring the issue of rights back into the countries and focus on the communicative aspect, I totally agree with you. Because here in the United States, advocates have just given up on the diversity rationale. It just didn't work. And so what they're looking at is admittedly a rather neoliberal view of the marketability of language. That language has a value on the global market and the global economy. And what you're seeing is all this grassroots effort within states and local communities politicizing language, but not really as a matter of rights that the state is children are entitled to, but as a political movement. So you see these skills in literacy being adopted in various states. You see dual language immersion programs coming in. And what they've done is they've co-opted middle class and upper middle class educated families to buy into bilingualism for its global value. So it's really been a political strategy in the United States, but it's built not on diversity. It's really built on communication.
And what do you think about it? So where do you stand normatively on that?
I mean, as somebody who's advocated minority rights, language rights for many years, it troubles me, but in a practical way, it works.
Yeah.
It does work. And so if you could put your ideology aside and keep your eye on the prize as to what you really want for minority children, the problem is in some of these communities, these dual language immersion programs are really being co-opted by the middle class and by educated parents. So there's the fear that some of these spots are being taken by students who really they're pushing out minority students in some ways. So that's one of the concerns. But I think if it works, okay.
So you raised a number of really interesting questions. So I think in Lao, yes, the court said meaningful education, but it explicitly connected it to the fact that the kids to gain meaningful education, they must understand. So they must understand, to be meaningful, they must understand what the education, and that's how they brought. You need to help them to assimilate into the English language so they can understand what they're studying to make the education meaningful for them.
There was a great quote from the Ninth Circuit in that case.
Yeah.
Judge Hostetler, she ultimately became Secretary of Education.
Yeah.
And she said something like, these children, it's as if they can't hear. It's as if, they're not, it's as if they're deaf. You're sitting in a classroom where they're not being given any information. It's as if they're just deaf.
So, precisely. So what we're going to do, we are going to correct for the deafness, so to speak. But it's not about we're going to preserve their ability to speak in Mandarin. It is only, we're going to protect them only insofar as it is needed to correct for the deafness. And then we will stop. We're not going to make sure that they remain so that to make them bilingual in Mandarin and in English. And what's so interesting about it is that we have the United Nations Human Rights Committee that guarantee a positive right to preserve minority languages. Then we have the European Court of Human Rights that only the Article 14 only has the potential of robust protection of minority languages. And then we have the Canadian regime that gives kind of hyper protection to two languages. And then we have the American regime that is only about negative linguistic liberties. And at the end, they all converge on the American model. So that's really interesting. What is going on here?
That's very interesting.
So, and then he said that the case with the cross. So something that is really important. It's not that international law, human rights law don't know what to do with culture. Some would say that the strongest protection for self-determination is culture. The people have their own culture, they need to have their own territory. The question is whose culture and who is left out. So the question is not about culture as such, but about whose culture is going to be kind of prioritized. And I'm with you for the last point. I'm with you. So I think that to the extent that we are committed to the protection of minorities, we need to think what's more on the ground, and we need to understand that the compromises will have to be made. So we need to talk about it rather than kind of move away from the very broad aspirational regime, move away from abstract rights, from a very beautiful nominal regime, and sit around the table and start talking, start negotiating.
Could I ask you a question on that grounds? I mean, or I have two different kinds of questions. One is, you know, I found it very interesting what you're saying, that there's a move, howsoever rich the conception of a rights regime of linguistic protection, we end up through a kind of cost-benefit logic, right? Which is really the kind of, you know, dollars and cents, the bottom line. We end up in the American situation. So I guess the one question that I would have is, you know, how much of this works to the extent that we are thinking through a North Atlantic framework for the ways in which this works? I mean, you know, in the Indian case, I think the question of, you know, language and linguistic rights is so different because of the state recognition of multiple languages, even if there is a hegemonic, you know, kind of bilingualism of, let's say, English and Hindi or something. But there are also other spaces. I mean, I'm sort of taking up your question of thinking through a set of political compromises, where there are numerous other spaces where multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multi-linguistic regimes parcel the divide in some sense between, or the relationship between language and state very differently. And it's not always on the model of multiculturalism. Right? So, I mean, so what I'm taking away also from what you've been saying is that multiculturalism, because it always works through the logic of majority and minority, and perhaps not on the logic of parity, sets up this normative problematic that you've sketched out for us. But what if the normative, if the normative playing field is not structured in this way? And B, what if we don't think normatively? I guess would be the other question that I'd also want to ask you, that if we don't necessarily, or we could think normatively and land up in this other very interesting space that you came to, which is, yes, let's actually protect linguistic diversity, but there's always going to be a class element for the middle classes and the upper, you know, classes today who, of course, want their children to learn Chinese or, you know, whatever else, because it's neoliberally speaking, this is what, you know, is actually going to give you. You want to be a bimodal subject and not the univocal one. So you could work the market logic to its constitutive limits and suggest a problem, or you could think politically and non-normatively and perhaps arrive at other solutions. So I guess two kinds of questions.
So yes, so I think. So I think India came up with a political compromise. It's really interesting political compromise because the kind of the common language is the language of the colonial power. Mm-hmm. So they didn't choose any one of the indigenous languages to be the language of the state, but then they maintain, and then they maintain linguistic multiplicity where none of the indigenous languages is the dominant language, but the dominant language is the language of the political state. Africa came up with different countries in Africa came up with different ways of reaching terms of political compromises. Were I to do this project again, I will probably look. So here I looked at Canada. I would probably look at South Africa. Mm-hmm. And I think that's my point. We can just need to look at particular countries, and those countries need to negotiate particular compromises that are appropriate for the concern of those countries, for the history of the country. For who are the people that we are trying to protect? Is it indigenous people to the country? Is it kind of immigrant newcomers? Is it different national communities that ended up in the same country, like in Belgium or like in Israel, and then try to tailor this compromise, not prison to human rights law, to kind of to category of thinking that comes to us from international law. And for the majority and minority, I really appreciate this question. So I think in a different set of my project, I'm examining how did we end up in the law, how did we end up understanding communities in the States with this category of a minority and a majority. Where did we get that? And it's happening during the interwar era, so during the Paris Peace Conference, we have the minority treaties. So this is the first time that we are importing into international law the understanding of the population in the country through the category of majority and the category of minority. And I'm looking at how did that come about and what were the forces that brought it about, and what's the kind of the distributional implication of that. And in that project, I'm looking at minority and majority. I'm suggesting that what is happening, one of the big entities that actually pushing forward the minority treaties, and historians today associate the minority treaties in no small measure to that network, is a transnational, is the Alliance Israelite Universalis, a transnational Jewish network that is extremely powerful at that moment. They're aggressively anti-Zionist, and they're suggesting the minority treaties as a way to protect Jews that are aggressively anti-Zionist outside Palestine, right? And ultimately, with the minority, and they are a network that operates across multiple territories, especially in the Muslim East, and they're very, very powerful. Ultimately, the minority treaties that they're pushing forward ended up kind of taking kind of pulling the rug under their legs, in the sense that what they did is they took what used to be a transnational ethnic religious network and located it inside territory, and told them you can now have cultural autonomy, but only inside this territory. What I try to do with looking at the way human rights law is now protecting linguistic and cultural rights is to say, okay, so now you took a transnational network. So the Alliance, this one network I'm examining is one example, but the Catholic Church is another example. So now you took, across the Ottoman Empire, there are multiple Christian networks that are not always connected to the Pope, that are providing a lot of what today we associate with the state, and the minority treaties push them into specific territories. So now in this project I said, okay, so how is that working for what we now understand as minorities? And so I had to suggest not that well, because this process of kind of localizing cultures, localizing transnational cultures is now kind of breaking them down even further. So now they're not only located inside the state, but they now need to protect their culture and language only on their own resources. Yeah, so it's like it's making them more and more controlled by the state.
Thank you. I have lots of thoughts, but my question that I'm thinking of gets a little bit outside of the sphere of law to focus more on the language that we use to defend these minority language rights. Because I think these two approaches that you talk about, the communicative value of language versus the identity-based value of language, you see that in the defense of languages being taught in universities and high schools, etc., far beyond the legal sphere, right? And you started out by talking about whose burden is it to bear the cost, right, of preserving language that only 60,000 people speak, right? So I suppose my question is a little bit of an open-ended one about how do we, if in reality, you know, diversity is a benefit to all of us, right? Being perhaps fluent in multiple languages is a benefit for all of us. How do we shift that burden? Why does the burden have to be on the two children of the mother who speaks this language, and how do we shift that burden to other, you know, like the students that you were mentioning earlier, the more privileged people who speak the dominant language, who can also learn these other languages, whether that argument is made in a communicative way or in a culture-based way, so that the burden is not only
does not fall only on the shoulders of the minority. And I think that this question goes outside the bounds of law, but it does perhaps fall within some idea of rights and language rights, you know?
Thank you. So, first of all, I want to, so diversity is good for all of us. For me, this is a question. I don't know that diversity is good for all of us. I don't even know that all of us exist. So I don't know that this category exists. There is the state, and there is the minority, and then there is the individual member into the minority. So in my example, there is the Romanesh mom, and then there's the Romanesh minority, and there's the children of the Romanesh mom, and the children are two, so I don't know, Susie and Norm, and maybe they don't have. So I don't know that diversity is good for all of us. And in my work, I'm not so interested in the pigs, you know, in people who kind of discriminate between individuals on the basis of language and kind of the biased people. I'm interested in the good people, in the people who say, yes, great, diversity. But you know what? We also want music classes for our children. We also want libraries for it. And I think that they also have legitimate demands. So I think that by saying diversity is good for all of us, so human rights activists and scholars don't say languages, it's important to protect languages as a normative matter. They say it's important to protect languages because it's good for all of us. So for instance, when we think about we need to give services to handicapped people. So say I'm a handicapped and you need to give me a bathroom. It's not because it's important to you. I have a human right to have a bathroom because inherent in me, in the dignity of me as a person, even if it has no benefit to you, the entire society. This is not what human rights people are saying about language. They say you need to protect it because it's good. The value is diversity for the whole society. And I think in making that move, they make the cost of non-assimilation disappear. And I think that there are costs of non-assimilation both for the minority and for the majority. For the majority, it's because it's a question of kind of a conflict of distribution. You know, if the pie is what the pie is, and if you pay for that, you don't pay for something else, and maybe that something else is important. And for the minorities, because they may fall behind, even if you protect them, that may actually be the reason that they fall behind because they don't speak the dominant language. Now the burden. I think it's really important to emphasize that what courts are here doing is they are shifting some of the burden. So they're saying to the minority language speakers, yes, they're allowing the state to actively incentivize the assimilation of members of the minority into the dominant language. How does the state actively incentivize? By paying for special classes in the minority. But in this case, Loud, in the American case, the US Supreme Court asked the state to accommodate the language of the Chinese students, to help them until they correct for the deafness, so to speak, until they learn the language. That's huge. So now they're taking the resources from taxpayer and asking the taxpayer pay for me to learn the majority language until I learn the majority language, help me that I don't fall behind on my education. That's a huge shifting of some of the costs associated with assimilation. So they do. So I think that's a kind of an important moment it's an important thing to put on the table. They're actually helping by paying to learn the language. That's big. But it's not about protecting the language.
Right.
No, it's the contrary, in fact, because that's an accommodation that tends towards assimilation and therefore towards the elimination of the minority language over time.
Passively.
Possibly.
Passively. So what the court is saying is, we are requiring you, state, to help the members of minority. We are allowing you, not requiring you. The only thing that we are requiring you is not to ban the use of minority languages in the private space. So case after case, they're saying, for instance, you can't tell prisoners not to write letters to their parents in their minority language. You can't tell prisoners not to talk to their parents in the minority language. So the only thing that they're requiring is not to ban the use of a minority language in the private. But we're telling that you are allowed to incentivize assimilation by offering all those positive accommodation to transitory assimilation in nature. Now, and we are telling to the minority, you can maintain your own separate language. Now, if you are unable to do it on your own dollars, we're not going to interfere. So if it's up to you to do it. If you can do it, that's great. We support diversity, but we are not going to force the state to pay for it. It's on your dollars. So Maybe yes, maybe no, maybe for one generation, maybe for 3 generations, maybe some minority community will be able to do it and other will not. The code is not going to interfere. So
it would be wonderful if there were a way to think about the problem and speak about the problem without having to refer to those who speak a minority language as bearing a burden. The whole language of having a burden and the comparison with disability and so on, it just shows what a dreadful state we're in with that. And I wonder, I don't want to sound heartless, but I don't know what the state can really, what can be hoped for from the state. There might be other channels, there might, private channels or community channels that could sustain a culture more effectively than having recourse to these international bodies that really are very distant and reluctant to act and make unenforceable demands of local, state and local authorities. There might be some other way, because fundamentally the language is going to survive if it's not felt to be a burden by those children. It's very important. You cited the Breton case, and the Breton case Breton is very interesting. It's a very strong revivalist movement in the north of France, in Brittany, trying to keep this language alive to the extent of funding schools privately to send children, and that in itself is very controversial because it looks on the face of it like a form of child abuse. You're sending your kid to a Breton school, often when the parents don't even speak the language, moreover. And it also coincides with a lot of interests that are very dubious in terms of their desire to maintain something like an idea of Bretonness, commercial interests in order to be able to have a label of Bretonness that will go on Breton butter or Breton pâté, and that will allow it to succeed in the national and the international market and so on. So it's all very messed up. I think the only way to genuinely break through all that cynicism and ambivalence and uncertainty is to make language desirable, and that brings you back to the culture, the production of culture.
can you say a little bit more about that? Why is it desirable? Why, if you connect language to protection of culture, it becomes more desirable?
I think that the situation you described at the outset is very, very good and very, very real. Imagine someone speaking Romanish. You have your children. How are you supposed to cope with that? The way for Romanish to survive and thrive is for there to be a vibrant culture using that language and using that language to produce culture. So there would be, as in the case of Scottish Gaelic, for example, is being sustained by rock groups and singers who are composing and singing in the language, and Welsh too to some extent. So there would be a radio station. So there would be community events to shift the idea away from burden to something more positive. It's simply all I'm trying to think if there were ways to do that, strategies to do that, rather than having recourse to the courts where you're already in a necessarily adversarial, acrimonious kind of relationship where nobody's going to be satisfied in the end.
Just to add to that a little bit, and also tie into the longer durée of this program, last year there was a symposium on indigenous, protecting indigenous languages.
It's called the Global Justice.
Global Language Justice, or in any case, this particular point that was just very well made came up, and I think basically just something I want to synthesize that many people that day spoke much more profoundly about, because there were so many indigenous groups, representatives there on the ground working with this problem in their communities, is that there are profound issues around not just preservation, but the fact that preservation needs to be reframed in terms of implementation and the obstacles to implementation. And I think one of the things that was so profoundly moving for all of us there, and revelatory and painful, was cultural trauma. And forgetting is very much related to cultural trauma. And when particular groups were talking about the issues around implementation and actually getting members of the community, especially the younger generation, to use it, it's very related to self-esteem. And so how do you feel about your culture is going to impact how motivated you are to keep that medium, that channel open, that language there, because that is what's so special about it, and that's to go back to the beginning of your talk, is when a language dies, a culture dies, an entire story dies, one that doesn't translate. You can't just translate from one to the other. There are words that just don't, that are in sense. So that just to add to that bit.
So of course, both of you are right. So of course, I said at the beginning, I think that when a culture, I think you put it beautifully, when a culture dies, there's no way of translating it. All of it dies. If we think that when a tree goes extinct is bad, I mean, it is bad, imagine what it means that the entire culture just disappears. Okay, so now we put that on the table. But how are we protecting that culture? And who is to protect that culture? And what is the best way to protect that culture? That's, I think, a very important question. And I think, and who should pay for the protection of that culture? So I think if we really are committed to the protection of that culture, we really need to think about it in distributional terms, in distribution of who pays, who is left out, and who benefits. And I think we need to, and I definitely agree that we need to think about it. So I don't know if so burden has a negative connotation, but we do need to think who is going to pay, not maybe financially, but who is going to do it, and what's going to be, what they're going to get, what they're going to lose out of it. And children, all of us have that capacity for learning languages, and if it's going to be Romanesh, it may impact our ability to study English. Now that may be good, that may be bad, but there is a decision, and that decision will be faced by the children, by the mother, by the minority, and by the state. We must put it on the table. I think that we must put it on the table. Now, what the state can do, I think the state can do a lot, and I think this vocabulary of rights, articulated in an abstract way, takes all the space and doesn't leave space to say that in fact the state can do a lot. So I suggest that instead of thinking about the right to use minority languages, the right, we should separate language into separate functions and think about each function independently. So for instance, there's a difference between providing education in the minority language, where here the cost is so massive, it's so big that it swallows the articulation of the right. To say providing leaflets during election translated into different languages, where the political importance of that is huge, but the cost is relatively little. So to say to the state, yeah, this you have to do, even if you don't need to provide education in multiple languages. Or say, you mentioned indigenous people, so to say to the state, you must allocate radio frequencies for indigenous people speaking indigenous languages, so that they could communicate between themselves, which is extremely important, say, in countries like Chile or Guatemala, where the indigenous population is very poor and oftentimes illiterate, and that's the radio in the indigenous language is the way for them to communicate. So to tell the state, no, you have to do it. So I think that there is many things that we can tell the state, and maybe we can even use courts to enforce those things. But if we move away from the kind of the ground vocabulary and break it down to specific, much smaller functions, and tailor the function to concrete situations. So is it Chile? So is it indigenous community in Chile? Or is it, for instance, Breton speaker? So Breton is a language that is kind of on the verge of extinction. So probably, the way probably to correct that is say education, so schooling. But there will not be a claim to say, okay, let's ask the market to operate in the Breton language. This is different, and I talked about it in my paper, this is different from, say, Turks living in Germany. Even if Germany coerces all of Turks to speak nothing but German, the Turkish language is not going to go extinct. So here the harm is something different. Maybe here the harm is about discrimination, and it is mapped into language. So what we ask of the state would be different. So to tailor specific to think about specific function in relationship to specific communities and to tailor a specific way to correct for those harm that are right for this community in this particular circumstances, but may not work for other communities.
May I introduce a different point? I'm a social worker. I'm not a lawyer. And I'm working with an agency that provides services for women from the Afghan community. One of the stressors, as everybody knows, in immigration is depression, isolation, possible suicide ideation. To provide the services in mental health communities that these people need, you need a translator. You can't provide mental health services appropriately unless it's a one-to-one communication. There's a gap in the time when the community can take up the services that it needs to provide to people when a community comes in and does not yet know the dominant language. And if they give up their own language, they're afraid they're not going to fit in yet because it's too early into the dominant community. So how do you rectify that gap? It can't be rectified. It's the voluntary community that's picking up the pieces because the state can't do this. And they may provide the services through Medicaid, which is their role, but if there's no provider, there's no way to get them the services that they need.
So what do you mean if there is no provider?
There is a provider who will accept Medicaid because all these people have Medicaid benefits. So that will pay for the service, but there's no provider in their language. And if you have a third person in the room, it puts a barrier between the communication professional and the patient. And it takes time for that to come to balance, and that can do damage in that period of time, not only to the parent, but the family and the community.
On a personal level, I completely understand the scenario that you're describing. For my kind of all personal life, I not long ago I gave birth to a very premature baby, and we were at the NICU for a long time, and we were surrounded, my husband and I and our baby were surrounded by families, many of them undocumented, that were at the same situation and not speaking a word of English. And it's not only that there was no translator, it was someone on the phone. So here you are with the baby struggling to live, with parents completely shocked and in trauma, and there's no person translating, but they're calling a translator who is located somewhere else, and that person is. So I kind of, even now when I talk about it, I feel my skin, you know. I don't know that there is a way to rectify that gap, though. I don't know if there is a way. I mean, for some communities, for instance, maybe you can find people in the country that came 5 years earlier, that they can come but even then you can't get over the fact that there is a third person in the room when you discuss. I don't know that there is a way. Why? Because language is also about communication. Because the issue is that language is both about identity and about communication, and you do need to have a means of communication, and there's no way of jumping over this gap until you have at least some people that can speak.
I'm wondering what the role of the minority members was and is and will be in the process of policymaking. We're talking about international or national or regional, human rights or language human rights policy, but how much engaged, involved, or even consulted, the minority community members are, and are we fighting, the human rights for them, or are we supposed to work with them, because what's their language attitude? What's their ideology towards their own language and the mainstream language? Do they want to protect their own language, or are they willing to share it? Because there are some, especially endangered language, speakers, they don't want to share their language. That's their thing. And also, I was about to ask the two values or the framework, identity and communication, but you just said yourself it can be both. It's not an either or. Or maybe it's neither. Because we see lots of effort in language protection, maintenance, and revitalization effort worldwide. There are probably more failed cases than successful ones. Like, about language identity, because there are some researchers show the local community members actually don't think it's closely connected. I mean, we can also see the case of Ireland or Scotland. Gaelic language, there are less than 100% speakers in the regions, but there is no doubt they have a very strong identity, Scottish or Irish identity. And then there are other cases, Maori language, it's usually considered as a successful example of language revitalization. Lots of the speakers, that we call them like new speakers, are actually not the Mandarin community members. So for them, this is neither identity or communicative, like tool, the Maori language. So I'm wondering, that's, it's not just those two, there are other ways, maybe.
Forgive me, I just want to make sure before I answer that I really I completely understand. So for them, language is not identity, not communication, is what?
I guess there's this 3 orientations towards language diversity. Language as a problem, language as a right, and language as resources. So maybe to them, it's the language as a resource.
So why is that not language as communication?
Well, I guess because it's not. I wouldn't say it's not a community. It's of zero communicative value at all. But in theory, it's not that Maori has some high market value. It's not that at all, because they are native English speakers. They could totally get about without speaking Maori language. So in that sense.
So thank you. So first of all, again, I don't know that we have something that is called minority. So I don't know that we have something that is called all the members of the minority, all of them have the same feeling about the preservation of their culture, the same feeling about the preservation of their language. There is a communication that brought before the United Nations Human Rights Committee that, again, in Canada, a native kind of an Indian in Canada, a woman, she left the tribe, she got married, and then she got divorced and she wanted to go back to live with the tribe, and the tribe refused. So it was brought before the Human Rights Committee. So it's really interesting. So we have the Canadian state. So we have the human rights law, the Canadian state, the minority, and the woman, and all of them have very different interests. And who are we signing with? It's really, really complicated because they don't have that. If we kind of choose the perspective of one of them, it's not the perspective of all of them. So I think it's worth putting on the table. Now I think it goes back to your question. What does the minority want? What does the minority ask? So I think it's really interesting if we say, okay, so if yes, when a language dies, a culture dies, a story dies, and that's very bad. We all lose. But I'm a Romanes child. I live in the U.S. and I don't want to study Romanes. I don't want. So what do we do? What do we do if for me it is a burden, but and I need to. So I think we need to. So like in my country, there's a story about two young people that come to an old lady and force her to cross the street, but she never wanted to cross the street. So I think we need to take that into consideration as well. And indeed, in Switzerland, many of the Romanes communities said that they don't want to study Romanes. It's not helpful for them. So it's a project of the state, but it's not necessarily the project of that community.
Just to add to the first part of your question, which we were just speaking to, but to kind of maybe reframe it. One thing that keeps coming up to me in terms of how much can minority members actually participate in the process of making policies is we've been talking a lot about what is it that the state can do. Maybe we can ask them to do more. I actually find
ask the state or the minority.
Ask the state. That's what we've been talking about.
Yeah.
I'm actually curious about the kind of they sort of disappear into the background, but getting more specific about the UN Human Rights Committee, European, how are those structured? In some ways, I kind of don't want you to spend time answering this because I could Wikipedia this maybe. I mean, and it would be a very, but like I feel like on some technical level, especially for an interdisciplinary group, although you sound like a lawyer, so it's like those are the kinds of things that become it's like we talk about the state because we can hold them accountable or try to for representation, but how how do UN representatives become representatives, and what is, I mean, not just minority members, how are they represented, how they can participate, but how do we participate? So I know that might actually be a really, it seemed like a really basic question that I myself couldn't answer, so I wanted to throw that out there. And then just on a pragmatic level, one thing that minority groups or indigenous groups that came to the symposium last year did present as a very pragmatic thing that they do want, and said it very explicitly, was acknowledgement of their sovereignty. And I think one of the things we could talk about with language, and part of our project, it's not just these different kind of ethnic language groups, national language groups, it's also institutional language translation, which is huge for justice, you know, just within English, translating the terms that are specific to the legal system into other words. But then think about that across language, that becomes complicated. The fact that a lot of these indigenous groups felt as if they were going to UN or UNESCO and saying, we have our administrative structure. These are our protocols. This is the way it looks, it's drawn up, there's a language around it. But that didn't compute. That was one of the frustrations that came up. And so actually kind of institutional translation as being another level to this, and maybe a pragmatic thing that could happen first.
So I really love the question only because it talks to the project I'm now writing that has nothing to do with language, but again, so I'm trying to kind of think about how do you end up with those categories of minority and majority, and what happened before 1919 through the Paris Peace Conference. Those transnational networks, cultural, religious transnational networks, I assume much like those indigenous communities that we saw now, had a de facto legal personality. That is, they had de facto they could participate in international lawmaking moment, in international convention, sometimes de jure as well, but definitely de facto. And it is that moment of the minority treaty, that moment of introducing to the legal, to our legal vocabulary the idea of minority and majority, is the moment where they lost, they were squeezed out of international legal personality. So now, yes, they can come to international setting, but only as a private network, and they can try and gather kind of galvanized political support, but they don't have a formal seat around the table, and it's much more difficult for them to be heard. Interestingly, one way for those transnational networks to be heard is through violence. So some of those networks that we do hear are those who are very violent, but the legal regime doesn't allow them any avenue to express their demands through the law before they explode on us. And I'm also trying to suggest in the piece that I'm writing now that it's kind of from both directions. On the one hand, those transnational, I mean in this context, transnational both in the sense that they cut across multiple borders, but also in the way that they don't give territorial content to the political identity. Not only that the legal regime doesn't give them any avenue to express their identity and to make their demands formally from within the legal sphere, and not only that it doesn't give them any legal avenue, we also almost don't have categories to understand what they're doing. We almost don't even have language to understand what does it mean to be a cultural community that is political but is not territorial. It's really difficult to figure out what they do. So not only that they don't have space in the law, but at the same time, and this piece talks to that, at the same time the obligation that they put on state to accommodate them are only negative. They're very minimal obligation, which then allow the state to do a lot to eliminate them by assimilating them. And I think how did we end up in that where we are now today really goes back to the minority, to that moment.
Well, thank you for pushing these questions. I think it's extremely important. I mean, the talk has been so stimulating, as you can see from the conversation here. And I also appreciate you asking some fundamental questions, really pushing hard. There's some impossible situations. We can't just assume diversity is good. I mean, we tend to assume diversity is good. Now you're asking we cannot assume, so we need to think more about that. And we cannot assume that human rights are good, almost. So we need to really think hard about these. I think these fundamental questions are usually not asked, not only in our context at the Soria seminar, but elsewhere where these tensions emerge, right? These rights in theory, like on the books and on the ground, and so how do we reconcile them? Is it unique to the situation of language rights, or does it ever emerge in situations where biodiversity is concerned? Are there similar debates there, at that level and at this level? And I think there are also some very good questions from the floor, so we'll continue the conversation. But time is running out, right?
Yes,
You
I
wanna
think we're.
make an announcement?
So thank you very, very much.